Welcome to Between Two Chairs, Demystifying Commercial Real Estate, the podcast that brings you the latest insights and trends on the South Florida commercial real estate market, with your hosts, Fernando Arencibia Jr. and Jennifer Woolman. In each episode, we dive into the world of commercial real estate and break down complex concepts to make them accessible for everyone. Whether you're a real estate professional, a curious investor, or just interested in the South Florida market in general, Between Two Chairs is the podcast for you. So pull up a chair and join us.
Alrighty, welcome everybody to Between Two Chairs. We continue our episodes focusing on small business because March is Small Business Month. So last week we gave you an overview of all of the numbers of the importance, the community effect, not just on a local and state level, but on a national level. And now we're going to do a deeper dive into how to work with these small businesses. So today we're going to talk a little bit about finding them the real estate and qualifying questions and
absolutely
all that kind of stuff.
That sounds awesome. Let's get right into it. I mean, it is our favorite thing to do is to help a small business, especially, many of us have worked with small businesses for 7 to 10 years. So we've seen their growth. They started small and then they started to need more space, more resources. You start to see their team grow, as they are creating job opportunities, and then they start expanding beyond your local, their original space. And then they start expanding throughout Florida, and it's a beautiful thing to grow and to see that growth and to see how conscientious they are about creating culture, about how purposeful they are in regards to their decisions, that all the microeconomic decisions that a small business has to go through. For us to be a small part of that is pretty amazing. It really is very impactful and very rewarding.
I agree. So let's focus on the tenant aspect, because most small businesses aren't going to start out buying real estate because of the cost, right?
That's right.
They're going to end up doing that later on. And we'll get into that. That'll be our last episode of March. Today, let's focus on tenants. And then next week, we're going to have a specialist talk about franchises and the difference between a small business that's a franchise versus what we're going to discuss today, both as a tenant and as an owner-operator. So let's get down to it. So you've represented a lot of small businesses, as have I. So tell me a little bit about how you get started.
I mean, the first thing is that we do this every day. This is our profession. This is what we are passionate about. And like anything that you're passionate about, you learn all the intricacies of it. And as you transact and you help a lot of small businesses, large businesses, get into space, you develop a certain, that's what they call expertise, right? Or experience, right? And so it's always important to not assume that they know how they have to go about leasing, space.
Or even what they're necessarily going to need in their space for their business based on local ordinances and requirements, et cetera.
Correct. Sometimes, and we've had this conversation in this podcast, sometimes a store looks like a store, behaves as a store, but it's not a store. Right, I had that situation with an industrial space in Little Havana. It looks like an industrial space. It was built as an industrial space, but there was a zoning change. Certificate of use expired. Now it's no longer.
Right, or just because there's a tattoo parlor across the street doesn't mean the one across the street can have a tattoo parlor.
Correct. So I think a big part of it is just to kind of, and I hate to use our subtitle, but kind of demystify for them what it is and what it isn't to rent a space. So first you want to know, as you get into the requirements, understanding a bit of their business is going to be very important. So a lot of times when I have small businesses call me, they go straight into, I saw this space, I'm looking for 1,000 square feet, right? They're just going into it because in their mind, they already know their business, they know what they're going to use it for, right? And so I think a big part of it is for, my recommendation to any broker out there is the first thing you want to do is really get into their business and really understand what it is that they do and what it is that their needs are and what is their what is their motivation?
Well, and is this their first venture or are they expanding? Because they might be a small business with one other location or several other locations, which means, they already pretty much know. So seeing the 1,000 square foot space, they might actually know that that's it and that's where they fit. But if it's their very first venture, oftentimes they get excited. I had this with a gym owner. They're like, oh my God, I'm going to open a gym. And, I have all these certificates and I've been a trainer all my life. Yeah. And they have this idea and it's like, okay, well, how much space do you need? Well, I think I need this much space. Okay. How, do you have a business plan? No. Do you have a financial plan? No. So how are you going to prove to the landlord your business concept and that you're going to be there past tomorrow and that you can survive, build out, right? A lot of small businesses don't take that into account, and they don't take into account the fact that the landlord's going to look for that. And not because landlords are unfriendly towards small businesses. No, I mean, most of the people that we know that own shopping centers love the small businesses, right? And a lot of the companies that we work with in terms of office space also love the small office user because they know that as they grow, if they're successful, they're going to expand. And if they're not successful, it's a small space to have to release. So always ask, a little bit, not only about their venture, but is it their first one? How experienced are they? Again, it might be somebody. I had another client, super experienced. She had owned restaurants before, extremely successful restaurants, sold her restaurant and wanted to open up a beauty salon and spa. And the concept was amazing. But when we started getting into the details, I was like, you're not ready to look for space yet. You don't know what you need. You don't know your concept. You don't know how much money it's going to take to build out the space the way you want it, et cetera. So she went back to the drawing board. It pushed them back a year. But guess what? When they were ready, they were ready.
So many moving parts, right? And every business is different and every business has different requirements. And so not all the spaces that are available are built for every business. And those are things that are, it takes, to your point, part of the conversation initially is to gauge how experienced is the operator in leasing space and what they know and what they don't know, And so think about the fact of what a small business has to go through when they're going into a space. Yes, the landlord wants to know their viability to be able to obviously pay the rent and the viability of their business. If it's a new venture, how experienced they are as operators, what they're going to be bringing to the table. Then there is the entire aspect of zoning, right? And being able to get a certificate of use to be able to utilize the space. Requirements are very different. If you're just going to run a store in a shopping center that is, clean, there is no need for water. There's no need for, in the case of a restaurant, a grease trap and a hood and a lot of what we call infrastructure that you have to build into the space. Those two groups are going to have a very distinct requirement. And you mentioned something, and I think it's very important to discuss mindset, because the landlord is not adversarial. It's the other way around. The reason why the landlord is looking for financials, the reason why the landlord is looking for an understanding of the business is, number one, they have a lot of different businesses already in the space that they have to figure out if it's going to be a fit, right? The best landlords always curate the space. The second thing is that they are invested in the success of the business. They don't want to create an environment in which they are putting pressure on a business that already has a ton of pressure to succeed in a business environment, in an economic environment. They want to be a source that will help that business succeed. And if it's not the right fit, it's not the right fit. I had a client who was looking to put a restaurant in a shopping center that had the space, that had the ability to, that it already even had the grease trap. However, what happened was that throughout the years, right, part of the certificate of use, requirement is a parking requirement, right? And so what they did is, because they had already put so many different food and beverage and medical office space in the shopping center, because the shopping center had a second floor office area. What happens is that those uses have a higher requirement of parking spaces per 1,000 square feet of space. So what occurs is that, the landlord did a parking study to figure out, well, will this operator, if I put him into the space, be able to go and get a certificate of use? Do we qualify? And the parking study came back and said that it would not qualify, right? I remember the the business owner being very upset. It says, like, they just don't want us there. They have it against us. And it's far from it. And I said, look, you're going to go invest all this money. You're going to go into the city. You're going to do this build out. And then you're going to go in there and they're going to tell you that you can't get a certificate of use, right? They know, and they're not trying to limit you. They would love to put you in there, but they have to go by, the requirements. One other thing, which I think is important to mention, is that when businesses are looking for space, they don't consider that there might be some lease restrictions from other tenants that are already in the shopping center that are going to prevent for you to be able to use, because some of the leases that are already in place prohibit competition that is similar to, to what they have there. I remember one time there was a McDonald's in Fort Lauderdale that had stayed vacant for a while, and people didn't quite understand, what was going on there. Well, when the McDonald's left, there was a lease structured in another part of the shopping center that prevented you from creating, and the lease language has to do with, like, you basically can't create a chicken sandwich, because there was a chicken place on the other side. So any new operator was limited. The landlord's rep would always sell it at, well, you could do like an open face or like a little flatbread, but you just can't make a sandwich,
Right.
And people think like, well, that's ridiculous.
Well, and in most grocery anchored, a lot of them say no bakeries, because if the grocery store has a bakery or it has a pharmacy or it has something like that, you can't do it in a grocery anchored store. And then the story that I told about this cute little restaurant with great food in South Miami, they had the most limited menu. I mean, so limited and really bizarre. And so I remember the food was amazing, no alcohol. And I went in there and I was like, what gives? You guys have great food, but like super limited menu. And they said, well, we didn't realize that our neighbor had an exclusivity and we can't sell anything anywhere related to anything on their menu.
Wow.
And obviously they didn't even last a year because they were so limited on what they could serve, and the rents in South Miami, are very pricey.
And that's why it's important to do your homework before, making sure that all the T's are crossed, all the I's are dotted. When people tell me I'm looking for 1,000 square feet, no, what you're looking is to grow your business. What you're looking is to be profitable. What you're looking is to be successful. So we got to find the right location in order to help you achieve all of those goals. It's not just that I want to be in that location. That location might not work for you.
Right. And that goes back to the qualifying questions, right? A lot of business owners come to us with the preconceived area in mind. And when we get into the questions and we start asking, well, what's your demographic? Who are you leaning towards? What's the demographic of your employee? What's the demographic of your customer? And all of a sudden we're like, so why do you want to be in that area? Oh, well, because it's cool and it's this, or because it's trendy, or because it's close to my home. And then when we do the demographic study and we show them, we're like, you're like 10 miles away from where your demographic is. Are your clients and customers and employees going to drive that far? And then you have to dig a little bit deeper.
What's really interesting about what you said? This is why this business is amazing, because there's nothing cookie cutter here, but it's really interesting when you ask probing questions, especially for businesses that are already established. They have a certain level of experience. They've already been in a location. They're growing, or etc. That sometimes they make decisions not based on, they're oftentimes making decisions based on the things that are more of a pain point than anything else that they're trying to resolve. Like, for example, staffing, right? So a business owner might make all the decisions in the world to find office space for their business, really not based on their preference of location, not based on, but it's more, to your point, about where do my employees live, right? So their pain point might be staffing. I gotta have less turnover. I gotta make sure people are happy here. I gotta make sure people come into the office. So their decisions are gonna be based on that, because that is the biggest factor for them in making the decision. And sometimes it's not necessarily about price. It's not necessarily about terms. It's not necessarily about a personal preference or a certain look, but it's more like, am I creating the culture that I want to create? Are the employees going to be happy here? Am I going to reduce turnover? Is this going to be a place where people are attracted to come to? Which is why oftentimes it's not even about the place itself. It's about everything that is surrounding it. I had someone come to us who asked us, basically, we want a lot of amenities, we want a lot of great places to eat, we want to have, we want to be able to walk to those places, and that's the office space that I'm looking for, you know. And that was their focus was always on that. And whenever I presented a property, they almost like would push around the pictures of the property itself, and they would first look at the location, at the map. Yeah.
So, in addition to that, like, we have a lot of people moving their businesses here or opening up locations here from other states. And I think that's poses a whole different set of questions, right? Because they might find a neighborhood that's similar to where they have in Chicago or New York or San Francisco. But to your point, they might not be thinking, okay, but does that area have the public transportation that my staff is used to in order to get there? So then it's like, okay, so you're moving your office down here, or you're opening a location down here. Are you going to hire local who are used to commutes and driving and our metro rail system and everything else? Or are you going to be hiring people from Manhattan? Are you going to be bringing employees who live and work in Manhattan? Because, again, that's a whole different mind shift for the employees. So in addition to those type of questions, timing, I find a lot of people are a little bit skewed on their timing. They think, okay, we get in there, we sign a lease. Well, depending on how big of a space you're leasing and for how long and how much TI you want, negotiating that lease can be months.
Yeah.
Not usually, but I've had some that have taken months for not a ton of space, but a lot of complicated build out when it was a vanilla space. And
would you attribute to the larger the company or the space that most likely that some of those negotiations take longer?
In a couple of different situations. One, it was the company. It was a big corporation. It wasn't necessarily a small business. It was a small division of a larger corporation. Correct. So there were a lot of people involved. And in the other one, it was the opposite. It was a small business leasing, but they were leasing from a huge REIT. And the lease in a REIT is, a couple hundred pages versus,
That's right.
So then you get attorneys involved, and then what does this mean? Or if they're coming from New York, there are terms down here that aren't the same as terms in New York. So those are things. And then even if you get the lease done in 1 or 2 weeks, well, if you need build out, how long is build out going to take? And that's going to vary depending on what municipality you're in. Are you in a county? Are you in a city incorporated area? To your point about grease traps, if you need to install a grease trap or get one recertified, then you're bringing in other type of entities beyond building and zoning. So those are the questions. Obviously, how much space do you need? And again, we go back into our usable versus rentable conversation so that the tenants are clear, so you think you need, I don't know, let's say 1,000 square feet, then you have to kind of educate them and find out, So 1,000 square feet of vanilla shell isn't necessarily 1,000 square feet once it's built out. So
Right.
you need to dig a little bit deeper there.
No, and to your point about timeline, that's an important component here because, some people start very late because they're in their mind they're thinking, well, I'm only looking for 1,000 square feet or something like that. I can rent that, right away. Sometimes that's not the case. You won't find it. Giving yourself enough time to be able to find the space makes all the sense in the world.
Right. The other thing is that I always like to ask is there anybody else involved in making the decision? And
Right.
this comes into play a lot when not so much with small businesses, because
Right.
usually it's the owners, but every now and then, I did have a small business that was opening a location here. They're a national small business,
Yeah.
or not national, they have a couple spaces somewhere else, but they were coming down here and they had their operations manager come out first, make
Yeah.
sure from an operations standpoint the locations and everything worked, and then
Yeah.
he kind of did the preview, but we always knew there was somebody else who was making the final decision.
Right.
Because if that's the case, then you have to find out what each one of them is looking for. So the operations is looking for a certain aspect,
Yeah.
but is that the only driver, or is there something else bigger? Like if the operations guy says yes to 5, is that going to be enough of a selection for the higher up to approve? And then, so always is there somebody else involved, and we're going to find out that becomes even more important with franchises, right? Because a lot of times they co-sign and there's
Correct.
somebody else signing on the lease.
Correct.
So
This always comes back to a lot of agents that are residential agents. They will get a call from a client of theirs. They're looking to rent out a space. They'll ask us, well, what's a commercial lease, right? And I know we've mentioned it before, but there is no cookie cutter commercial lease. And part of that reason is for all the reasons that you mentioned,
Right.
And there's just so many different ways of slicing up how a commercial lease is going to look like. And part of that is what you negotiate. Part of that is the requirements that are that the ownership has. Part of that is a requirement that, to your point, if it's a franchise, now the franchise has to be involved in that aspect of it because of the agreements that the franchisee has with the franchise.
Well, and a lot of time from what tenants and tenant reps, especially if you're starting out as a tenant rep, what you always need to keep in mind is that oftentimes the landlord isn't even the only one making the decision, because if they have a mortgage involved, a lot of times there are prerequisites that the lender puts on them for what a lease can and can't have and the type of businesses and everything else. So again, don't get upset at the landlord. They want you to succeed, but there could be limitations that they have or that the site has that mean that it's just not the spot for you.
Well, one of the things that I find that is important is to understand, what percentage of their budget is going to go towards the space. Because some people have very tight requirements when it comes to that in order for their margins to make sense. Mm-hmm. Sometimes small businesses don't look at it from that point of view. They're only looking at price, but they're not looking at percentage of revenue, because at the end of the day, businesses that are very smart, they'll say, well, if I can generate X amount of revenue from this space, as opposed to another space down the street that is going to be cheaper, right? They're looking at it in terms of percentage. Do I have more of an opportunity to grow here than down the street where the overhead is a little lower, right? But the ability to really create the revenue is higher here.
Right. So that also comes into play. Are you an impulse type tenant, where your clients are just coming, they happen to be at the grocery store and they just need to pop into the dry cleaners or the UPS store or whatever it is that your business is? Or is it a tailor? And they know that you're the tailor and they need to go to you, because that's going to also depend on whether you get primo retail space or kind of, elbow or tucked in the back space, which has lower rents. But to your point, you and I love pizza, right? We're pizza fans. Mm-hmm. So if you find out what your demographic is and it's an impulse buy, or it's somebody who needs to stop by quickly on the way home, or the kids are in the car after soccer or whatever it is, you're not going to want to be someplace that's hard to get to, even if the rent is significantly cheaper, because you might be able to make up the extra rent by selling an extra 4 or 5 pizzas. And in that more expensive space, you're going to sell an extra 20 pizzas, right? So
exactly.
To your point, it's not always about the number. And that's our job, is to help explain that and show that and show sales in the area.
I just want the business owner to have all the different perspectives so that they can make the best decision for themselves and their business. But it's not as simple as I'm not willing to pay more than X amount per square foot.
Right.
In a property. There's so many different ways to look at it, and it's to the benefit of the business owner to really have all that information in order for them to make
I think
the best decision. That
goes back to the question. So when you ask, because we always ask, well, what is your target price per square foot or your target rent or whatever? Is that all in? Because then that makes the difference between base rent, triple nets, et cetera. But then it becomes, well, okay, what is that base? You have to always dig a little bit more. What is that based on? Is that based on selling X number of widgets? What if I could find you a more expensive space that would double the number of widgets you could sell or whatever, so that you can get a clear answer?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that it's all an education process. And the more you work with small businesses, the more you work with that business, the more you get to know what are their pain points and what are the things that are non-negotiable and the things that really they want to achieve, but they haven't really figured out how to if this is the location that is going to help them best achieve it.
Right. And to your point, I think it really depends to, you always have to ask, because you don't think about it until it happens. But is there any use that you have in your space that is going to have a higher demand than most businesses on any of the utilities, right? Mm-hmm. Something like a crypto company, huge demand on electricity. There are very few places where that works. But if you're showing them spaces in areas where they don't have that electrical load, same thing, distilleries, high water, high sewer. Right. So you need to make sure that the areas have that capacity, that they have the size of the piping, et cetera, in order to get in. So those are things that they might not even be thinking of, because they're thinking of the space, especially if they're beginning. They might not, or they might just assume, well, if I say I'm a microbrewery, you're going to know that I need X amount. But I don't know if you're doing, just enough beer for show here, and your distribution or your distillery, your main plant is somewhere else, or if this is it. So it's always very important not to assume and to keep digging and expanding on original answers. There might be more, to your point, to what's behind one of the answers.
I agree.
So, all right.
Awesome.
Fun fact time.
I love it.
Did you have
what
yours?
do you got? I do have mine. And that is actually, it's a report that just recently came out by JP Morgan Chase, and it's about small business financial outcomes in Miami communities. And they figured out that 75% of firms in Metro Miami were profitable, with a median profit margin in Miami metro area of 13.9%. So that was
awesome.
That was interesting. So, not only do we have a lot of small businesses, but they seem to be doing well.
They seem to be doing well. Good. So another option is, business brokerage, which we didn't get into. We'll get into that a bit with our other 2 episodes. Mm-hmm. But there are over 600 small businesses for sale on our MLS. That doesn't include all the other businesses that are for sale. So that's really popular here with our foreign buyers coming in from out of town. A lot of them own companies. We have somebody, his family owns an ice cream shop or a chain of ice cream shops in Colombia, and they want to open one here. So do they start from scratch, or do they find an existing ice cream shop that's for sale? So all the possibilities. I love real estate. Oh my God, I love this.
You do it. Just get him over here. Just get him over here.
I know. We'll be there. We'll be there. Because everything's better with ice cream or chocolate.
There you go.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Everything is better with chocolate. All right, guys. Have a good one. Thank you so much for joining in and listening in. We appreciate you, and we appreciate any and all feedback. Thank you. Bye.
Have a great day. Bye.